Our text for this evening is Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to consider the views of those who regard this scripture with utmost seriousness. A topic of some interest among both scholars and interested lay people is the degree to which the United States is or ever was a Christian nation. Arguments over school prayer, over creches on the courthouse lawn, or crosses erected by the state to designate the site of auto fatalities all touch on this issue. Most of the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, partook more heavily of Enlightenment rationalism and deism than biblically based evangelical Christianity. But one can make a plausible case that in the middle decades of the 19th century, in the wake of the Second Great Awakening with the camp meetings in the South and the revivals of such as Charles Grandison Finney in the North, America came as close as it ever has before or since to being a Christian nation. This was a short-lived hegemony. As Susan Rose will note, I think, the public schools were carriers of the dominant ethos, which was not only Christian and Protestant, but largely of a sort fairly characterized as evangelical. And then came a series of serious challenges. Darwin's Origin of Species and the Descent of Man, which provided an explanation for biological life, including humans, that did not require a god or even an intelligent designer, to use more contemporary language. German biblical criticism, which looked at the Bible, much as it would other great historical or literary documents, as a human, not a divine product, with the strengths and weaknesses of other human products, and certainly not a book inspired of God or free of error. And an influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, immigrants who were Roman Catholic and Orthodox, immigrants who were Jews, both Orthodox and atheist, and white Protestants, mostly of Western and Northern European stock, correctly recognized that the dominance they and their beliefs had enjoyed were being challenged. Some Christian churches adapted to these challenges by embracing what they could and making a tolerable accommodation with the rest. Others, who eventually came to identify themselves as fundamentalists, decided to resist these changes. And one facet of their resistance, lasting now more than a century, has been played out in the arena of education. From the late 1800s onward, Protestant fundamentalists formed Bible institutes and colleges in which their understanding of biblical truth and sound doctrine could be taught without corruption by the more dangerous aspects of the humanities and social sciences with their notoriously relativizing tendencies. In recent years, particularly during the past 3 decades, education and the socialization of children have played an increasingly important role in the consciousness and behavior of conservative Christians as they sought to train up a child and their children in the way they should go. And 2 dramatic manifestations of this have been the astonishing proliferation of private Christian schools and the burgeoning homeschooling movement. A third important initiative has been the attempt by some conservative Christians to reshape public schools by gaining control of school boards at both state and local levels, with an eye toward strictly overseeing the content and methods of instruction as well as other school policies. Failing that, and in fact many conservative Christians see little hope of real success, some urge total abandonment of public schools, often labeled government schools, and regarded as institutions that are hopelessly lost to Satan. Tonight, we have a remarkable opportunity to listen to 3 scholars who have long specialized in these matters. One of the things I've enjoyed so much about being able to organize these various programs has been the opportunity to invite people whose work I've read and whom I wanted to meet. And if you write them a letter and say, we'd like for you to come, they often come. And it's been a delight for me. Professor Susan Rose will talk to us about private Christian academies. Professor David Sickink will share his quite interesting and sometimes surprising research on homeschooling. And Professor Bruce Biddle, one of the country's most articulate and well-respected defenders of the public school, will tell us, I suspect, that not everything negative you may have heard about our public schools is grounded on solid rock. This program, you may recall, had originally been scheduled for September and had to be postponed because of the upheaval caused by the events of September 11. I'm grateful to our speakers for their willingness to give it another try, and pleased that we can be here this evening under far less stressful circumstances. And I should say that most of them, coming from where they come from, do not consider this weather to be something one could not get out in. They have all seen worse weather, even recently. The first speaker tonight, Dr. Susan Rose, is the professor and chair of the sociology department at Dickinson College. She's the author of 2 books on contemporary fundamentalism, Keeping Them Out of the Hands of Satan, Evangelical Schooling in America, and Exporting the American Gospel, Global Christian Fundamentalism. Both of these have been, I think you would enjoy reading. They're very helpful, insightful books, and numerous articles, other studies on religion, on gender, now doing some important work on the sex education in cross-cultural circumstances. She's worked on pluralism. She was an advisor and a contributor to the Fundamentalism Project, to volumes that were edited by Martin Marty and Scott Appleby, published at the University of Chicago Press from 1990 to 1995, which stand as definitive works, really definitive volumes having to do with contemporary fundamentalism. You may have heard her on NPR. A lecture of hers was included in the Best of Knowledge series on NPR, and she continues to work on these issues both in the United States, and her field work has taken her abroad, the Philippines, Guatemala, South Korea, and other places. So I'm very happy to welcome tonight Dr. Susan Rose.
Thank you, and I want to thank in particular Bill Martin for inviting me to talk in particular tonight about the strengths and weaknesses of Christian schooling within the context of the U.S., and I hope perhaps in the discussion period we can also move that discussion abroad as well and look at the export of Christian schooling that began in many cases in the U.S. to some of these other places. Controversy over public education and the resurgence of evangelical activism have characterized the latter decades of the 20th century. In the U.S., significant litigation and legislation have accompanied the secularization of public schools and the proliferation of Christian, that is, private evangelical schools. Centering on the issues of states' rights versus parents' rights and church-state relations, the legal and philosophical battles have spilled over from the classroom into the courtroom and have influenced both public and private education. As battlegrounds for social change, the public schools have become a contested terrain of political and religious struggle. Although the mission of the common school was to rise above politics, public education has not escaped the conflicts that come with the pressures of interest group politics. Conflict is central to the educational arena as educators and policymakers contend with the meaning and realities of democratic pluralism. Thus, it is not the presence of conflict that is surprising, but rather the absence of an ideology that explains it, particularly in a society that celebrates competition in the political and economic arenas. As Barbara Finkelstein has argued, the multifarious events and occurrences that define the history of education in urban America can be understood as attempts by one or another group to preserve, protect, nurture, rebuild, and/or transform community. It is a history of conflict between increasingly diverse groups for control over the network of relationships enclosing the young and for the power to censor, filter, and define significance. The fundamental question then is whose right and whose responsibility is it to teach what to whom, and what kinds of resources will they be allotted? In the mid-19th century, the Protestant majority rallied to establish a common school that would socialize all children, especially immigrant children in need of Americanization. Manifest destiny began at home, in the schools. With the disestablishment of religion in 1833, churches operated on the basis of volunteerism and competed with one another to recruit members. The public schools became the arena in which all Protestants worked together. In essence, they became the substitute for the American National Church. Catholics, resisting the degree of Protestant control over public schools, established their own parochial school system in 1874. While the contemporary proliferation of the Christian schools represents the first widespread secession from public schooling since the establishment of the Catholic parochial school system, it isn't a new phenomenon. As Bill Martin has already discussed a little bit, most denominations did experiment with religious weekday education throughout the 19th century, although the idea never really took off. By the early 20th century, most mainline denominations had abandoned the idea of religious day schools altogether. While fundamentalists continued to establish a number of independent post-secondary educational institutions and Bible colleges, it was not until Protestant control of public education gave way to secularization in the mid-20th century that fundamentalists actively began to establish their own primary and secondary schools. They called their schools Christian, in contrast to other religious schools, those established by Catholics, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Quakers, and Amish, among others. And the term Christian is used by them to emphasize the distinction they draw between the saved and the unsaved. Interdenominational and Protestant Christian schools actually represent a range of evangelical groups. The term evangelical is often used inclusively, as I employ it in this paper, to refer to coalitions or alliances of fundamentalist, charismatic, and neo-evangelical Christians, all of whom share the basic evangelical tenets. And these include a belief in Christ as personal Savior, the necessity of a conversion experience in order to be saved, the Bible as the inerrant Word of God, and the necessity of spreading the gospel and converting others to Christ. Dr. Paul Kienel, who was the former executive director of the Association of Christian Schools International, represented the view of many Christian school promoters when he wrote that, and I quote, "The unofficial partnership between the Protestant Church and the public school is in serious decline. Therefore, we are taking the initiative to reestablish quality Protestant education in our country." A grassroots movement of the 1950s, Christian schools proliferated in the late 1960s and 1970s. Until the 70s, they tended to be relatively scattered and powerless, but throughout the 1970s, they began to organize through Christian school associations. As Withmow and Liebman write, politically active evangelicals of the 1970s and 80s cut their political teeth defending the Christian schools that they had helped to organize. Once the sponsors and regulators of the mainstream educational system, evangelical Protestants felt compelled to pursue alternative forms of education in the closing decades of the 20th century. Their actions were motivated by their desire to restore religious authority to American society, to reinforce parental authority, and to provide quality education for their children while protecting them from drugs, sex, violence, and the lack of discipline that they perceived to be rampant in public schools. They have acted in response to a series of perceived threats, the most serious of these being the general secularization of life and the legislatively mandated secularization of public schools. Supreme Court decisions prohibiting prayer, Engel versus Vitale, and Bible readings and devotions in public schools, the School District of Abington versus Schempp, offended evangelicals because these actions excluded God. Just as the Vietnam War and Watergate challenged the notion of America as the righteous empire, fundamentalists were becoming convinced that their own civil religion had suffered erosion. A religious patriotism had been excluded from public schools. And I might add here that I think Lynn Cheney has become an effective ally for them, particularly in the last couple of months. And that's maybe something we want to talk a little bit more about later. Today, some 1.3 million students are enrolled in an estimated 9,000 Christian schools, K through 12. These enrollments represent approximately 25% of the total school population, private school population, and 2 to 3% of the national school population. Even during a period of reported high unemployment, when there existed a very real threat of a national economic recession, and when enrollments in both public and non-public schools were declining, the Christian school movement grew dramatically. And although the Christian Roman Catholic schools still comprise the largest group in private education, a realignment has occurred within the private sector, where the Christian schools have grown both in numbers and also in relative influence. And in fact, I would argue that actually the numbers are less important than the kind of influence the Christian schools have had, both within private education and also the New Christian Right has had on public education in the U.S. Evangelicals continue to critique public education even as they establish their own schools. During the past 3 decades, they have mobilized and made a significant impact on both religious and secular schooling. Across the nation, public schools have been pressured to remove books from classrooms and libraries, to teach scientific creationism as well as evolution, to eliminate sex education and introduce abstinence-only programs, to adopt textbooks that reinforce traditional American values, and to avoid controversial subjects in the classroom. This does not mean, however, that the Christian school movement has met its goals, nor that it is monolithic. Many fundamentalists argue that Christians should maintain their own separate schools, for if they are true believers, they could not possibly entertain the idea of sending their children to public school. And one of these representatives is Marianne Brown, who wrote in the Gospel Herald, and I quote, "The nation would consider utterly ridiculous the idea of sending its soldiers to Russia to be trained in order to later fight that nation. Just so, it is ridiculous to have children trained in the world to combat the forces of evil." Such strict separatists, however, are accompanied by accommodationists who see Christian schooling as an alternative to public schooling and leave the choice to parents, and also by interventionists who see the public school as a type of mission field and suggest that it may be unchristian to retreat from and abandon the public schools. What I would like to do this evening is share some of the observations, fieldwork observations that I've done among 22 Christian schools over a period of about 2 years. And I'll focus in particular on 2 schools that I think represent the spectrum of Christian schooling. One is the Lake Haven Academy, which is a working class fundamentalist Baptist academy that is in upstate New York. And it's located in primarily a rural working class area of high unemployment. The other is about 50 miles away. I'll refer to it as Covenant, and it is a middle class independent charismatic school that's run by its congregation. Both of these schools were started in 1974, have a population of about 75 students, are church-run, and even though they share very similar evangelical tenets, I think what you'll see as I move through this discussion is that the theological orientations and also the class differences in the sponsoring congregations have a major impact on the kind of schooling their children receive. While both Covenant and the Lake Haven Academy define the secular world as evil, their ways of dealing with that world differ. Like the Covenant Charismatics, the Academy fundamentalists support the free enterprise system and the privacy of the family, and feel threatened by big government, affirmative action, and the women's movement. But in response to changing social norms and economic conditions, the Academy fundamentalists tend to withdraw from the world and do the best they can within their own community. The Covenant Charismatics, on the other hand, feel they are responsible for counteracting unacceptable trends in the larger society. And I quote here one of the Covenant preachers, "In folk religion, people were told to close the windows and keep out the devil. We, however, are on the offensive. The blows we receive are from a retreating enemy. This does not mean that they're not serious. They are, for the enemy is trying to recapture lost ground." These theological orientations towards the outside world strongly influence how these groups socialize and educate their children. Contemporary fundamentalists are instructed by a history of separatism and instinctively seek to protect their children from the world. And I quote again, "Some people say we are protecting them from the world, sheltering them," an Academy mother acknowledges. "Well, that's right. I don't want them in the world. I want them to go into Christian service. It's like tomatoes in a greenhouse. You have to protect them and nourish them until they grow strong before you put them in the garden." The Academy fundamentalists pray that their children will be able to preserve their faith in the midst of a contaminating secular world. To be a good Christian and citizen means to work hard and take care of the family. It means taking care of one's own rather than trying to affect social and political change. While the Academy fundamentalists emphasize the ability of the individual to withstand evil and temptation, the Covenant Charismatics stress perfectionism and the power of the collective to change the world. They are preparing the children to act on the world. And I quote from their handbook, "We do not want to keep them from the world, but from the evil one. We want them to be able to discern right from wrong, good from bad." Kingdom education comes to its fullest when the home church school community surrounds a student with a consistent environment where Jesus Christ is the center. The children who can weave in and out of these 3 institutions and find life abundance will be able to form a well-equipped army of mature individuals ready to go out into a deteriorating world and conquer every domain for the King. The process of socialization reflects the interaction of the theological and class orientations of these 2 communities. The predominantly middle-class charismatic parents and educators rely on intensive interaction with students in an attempt to instill their values and beliefs. They are communicating the world, their view of the world as a place in which individuals are actors who can change the world, Taking in Niebuhr's terms, a Christ as transformer position, the Covenant educators want their children to be well prepared for higher education and professional careers so that they as Christians can transform the society from within. And they have no problem imagining their children going to secular universities. If they can get into an Ivy League university, all the better. They'll have even more influence, they believe. Part of the process involves discussion and joint activities as a form of interactive learning where ideologies are explored and explanations are given. And I would say within the Covenant, you see various editions of the Bible being read and discussed. There are lots of group discussion going on. A number of different viewpoints will be given. Various religious traditions will be explored within the context of the classroom. There are a lot of essay questions that are written. And an exposure to a range of reading and materials is encouraged. And I think what you'll see as I begin to describe the Academy, it's a very different situation there. The Lake Haven fundamentalists, who want their children to be well trained in order to secure a dependable job and support their family, are happy, in fact, when the children may go on to community college or on to Christian colleges. Most of these children are coming from working class backgrounds whose parents have not gone on to college, and most of them will be first-generation college. Recognizing that in today's market, that standard increasingly means that children will need some college education. Again, they're encouraging their children. But also, one of the goals for them is that their children may not just be stuck on the shop floor, that they may actually be able to get out, have a job working outside, whether that's in lumbering, going back to the farm. So there are a number of sort of mixed expectations and hopes for their children. But anticipating the service jobs that most of them will fill, the Lake Haven Academy relies heavily on rules to regulate their students' behavior. And they've chosen a highly standardized and individualized system of instruction, accelerated Christian education, and I'll be referring to that with the acronym ACE for the rest of the talk. And ACE encourages individualism and privacy and reinforces conformity to external demands. The program in the school is characterized by a high degree of supervision, routinization, and tradition. And the Bible verses are recited only from the King James Version. There are few supplementary texts other than ACE that are used in the classroom, and the few reference books that they have date back to the 1950s. Neither group discussion nor essay writing is part of the regular curriculum. And what we find is this is not only remarkable in many ways for the Lake Haven Academy, but about 2/3 of Christian schools that are initially established use ACE, mainly because it's a very inexpensive curriculum. The total cost for materials is about $1,000 a year per child. And a church can pretty easily set up a school in the basement of the church. ACE provides all of the materials they need in terms of curriculum, in terms of furniture. And the furniture, in fact, consists of cubicles. So they'll have rows of cubicles with blinders so that each student has their own student office. In fact, they're not referred to as desks. They'll be referred to as cubicles with blinders so that they can't see the other children. And the thought here is that it minimizes distraction, that rather than tempt one another, they will just be enclosed and have very little interaction actually with other students who may be sitting across from them, but again, the blinders are blinding them from seeing the other students. Also, teachers don't have to have a college education, nor do they have to be accredited. So again, the salaries are much lower than for public school teachers and many other private school teachers. And one of the most controversial parts of ACE is that it's believed that, particularly by Donald Howard, who is the founder of ACE, that you don't really need to teach in ACE schools, that students can teach themselves. In fact, teachers are referred to as supervisors, and the teacher aides are referred to as monitors. And it's very much based on an office, sort of a factory office kind of system. When the students have an academic question, they end up raising an American flag, and on the blinders here, there'll be 3 holes. And so if they have an academic question, the American flag will go up. If they want to go ahead and test how well they're doing, they have these testing sessions, and once they've learned the material on their own from their individual paces, they'll go to the testing section, and in order to get approval to do that, they'll raise the Christian flag. And if they have some minimal question about needing to sharpen the pencil or going to the bathroom, then the school flag will be raised. And the supervisors and monitors will circulate around the room. Only the supervisors respond to the American flags, the monitors respond to the Christian flags and the school flag. It's also very highly regulated in a number of other ways as well that is very different from the Covenant School. And it's peer monitoring as well as the supervisors and monitors. When the children want to get a drink of water from the water fountain, they'll have students standing there and they count 7 seconds. And each student can go and drink for 7 seconds and then the next moves along, very much in single file. You find in the charismatic school at Lake Haven, the children can go to the bathroom pretty much whenever they want. They have their own areas where they can put their coats and their lunch boxes, and if they need to get something out of there, they can go. And even the kindergarten and first grade teachers will leave a whole classroom for 5 or 10 minutes if they need to talk to another teacher or get supplies. The thought is that the children actually are pretty well disciplined. They're able to take care of themselves. And this belief also in perfectionism that they will rise to the challenge really permeates the dynamics within the classroom, very much in contrast to the Lake Haven Academy, where it's thought that one, again, needs to be careful of evil and to reduce the kind of temptation. ACE was started in Louisville, Texas, in 1970, initially as a nonprofit venture, and then became a for-profit corporation in 1972. By 1979, it was grossing $1 million a month. When it began in 1970, ACE was working with 45 students. By 1972, there were 4,000 students. By 1980, 275,000 students. And as of 2001, ACE's School of Tomorrow reported that they had 7,000 schools, 14 government contracts, and thousands of home educators in 131 countries. The average school serves about 35 to 70 students. So again, it's interesting not just because of Lake Haven, but I think in terms of the number of schools that are using the ACE curriculum. And that's actually how I began my fieldwork also in Guatemala. It was really following up on the ACE schools that were established there and in other countries. And I was particularly interested, given the philosophy of the school, of how it was adopted by schools in other countries, because it has a very pro-American free enterprise philosophy that comes through, particularly the social studies PACEs, but through some of the others as well. And I wanted to just give you a sense of some of what they're teaching within the context of the PACEs. This is from a 12th grade social studies PACE, and the PACE is an individualized system of instruction. One of the emphases on individualized instruction is the student may be working at the 12th grade social studies pace, but at the 7th grade math pace. So again, you can individualize the instruction that way. So from the 12th grade social studies pace, and I quote here, Jews and Roman Catholics deny the power of the living God and so lack the inner power to live a truly biblical and therefore a truly free life. The same packet argues that the free market economy diminishes rather than increases the amount of inequality in society and insists that a wealthy class is important for motivating the poor to improve themselves. In its discussion of the conflict between creationism and evolution, it posits that, and I quote, one of the two has to be wrong. Both cannot be right. It is logical to trust Darwinism. Is it logical to trust Darwinism or God? It has been said that evolution, like Christianity, turned the world upside down. Darwinism, however, did it for evil. In latter years, men began to apply Darwinian thought to social relationships. The result of this extension of evolutionary thought was known as social Darwinism. The survival of the fittest was applied to business practices and politics with disastrous consequences. Both the Nazism of the German Third Reich and the Soviet international communism justified their acts of terror, oppression, and racism with the theory of social Darwinism. And again, what I would add here is that it's all objective testing. There are no essays. There's no group discussion. These would all be multiple choice answers or true false. So once you had worked through this pace, you would then go to the testing area, and your answers would either be right or wrong. Both ACE and secular critics have recognized ACE as innovative and potentially influential in providing leadership for educational reform. The education offered at the Baptist Academy appears to anticipate the future of efficient, corporate-oriented instruction. The emphasis on orderliness and discipline at the office learning station realistically mirrors the working stations of many present and future jobs. The increasingly automated or computerized clerical or office job requires someone who is willing and able to sit at a word processor or at a computer terminal for an entire day with little or no interaction with fellow workers. It also corresponds to the standardization of production and procedures now practiced by many large corporations in the service, manufacturing, insurance, and banking fields. Low-level and middle managers all over the country, and in fact all over the world, use extensive operations manuals to instruct and govern the smallest procedures performed by the employees they supervise. The manuals severely limit the kinds of decisions the managers themselves can make. ACE methods likewise reflect, in a more extreme form, the de-skilling and reskilling process which is taking place in curricular reform in the public schools. Some American parents from both the working class and increasingly also from the middle class, if you look at the demographics of the Christian schools, are asserting the right to control their children's education at a price they can afford. Their sense of empowerment should not be lightly dismissed, even if the real control is limited to the degree that they purchase a franchised corporate product. But in 10 or 20 years, it may be evident that these sacred schools were the experimental testing grounds that preceded a massive invasion of the education business by corporate America. And clearly, I think we also see this happening by Whittle, Channel 1, particularly the current controversy right now in the Philadelphia schools. These children may become good workers, but they may not become full citizens. In fact, because of the process as well as the content of their education, ACE students are unlikely to challenge the kind of education they are receiving or even to question whether or not they have been educated. The parents and educators of the ACE students are making compromises. Many of them realize that their own and their children's opportunities are limited. Therefore, they create an educational environment that will better ensure that their students learn the basics and become well-disciplined workers. Moreover, the most fundamental values and beliefs are not challenged, nor is their self-esteem put on the line by teachers who may devalue their working class and fundamentalist culture. Academy parents and educators are pleased that their system is well suited to preparing disciplined, punctual, obedient, conforming, and self-instructed students who will make good workers. The principal of the Baptist school, in extolling the virtues of his ACE school, remarked that the military is pleased with ACE students because they are disciplined, obedient, and respect authority. And I quote, "They make good workers, and that's not all that easy to come by these days. Not that I want all of them going into the military. I'd like to see some of them going into Christian ministries." By and large, the Academy is successful at getting its students to finish high school without dropping out, and increasingly successful preparing them for college. And one of the other things that I would say here in defense of the Lake Haven Academy is that they took a number of students who had been expelled from public schools, many who had learning disabilities or emotional problems or social problems, in fact, came to Lake Haven. And I know some other studies, Nancy Emmerman's and Alan Peshkin's work, found that by and large ACE was not taking problem students. This particular school went in a very different direction than that. Okay, the compromises of success. Christian schools represent the mobilization efforts of evangelicals to establish greater control over the socialization and education of their young. These parents and educational leaders of the Christian schools to protect their children from the degradation of modern secular life. But while they react against the commercialization of culture, many develop, buy, sell, and use mass-marketed curriculum packages which dictate virtually every aspect of school life. Although Christian schools stress the values of the traditional patriarchal family and the natural submission of women, because of their size and curriculum, the schools ironically do not tend to segregate boys from girls, nor do they present them with different curricula. The education for boys and girls tend to be quite similar, although traditional gender roles are reinforced within the texts themselves. And adult men clearly have more status than the adult women in the community. And in the vast majority of Christian schools I looked at, male teachers are also paid much more than female teachers on the basis of family wage. Given that Christian schools tend to select a relatively homogeneous student population, most often drawn from the ranks of sponsoring congregation or neighboring congregations, there is a high degree of consistency among the major socializing institutions of church, family, and school. The majority of parents tend to share similar class backgrounds, interests, lifestyles, and aspirations for their children, and also share them with their teachers. And in part for this reason, as well as the demographic factors, multiculturalism is something that many Christian schools don't have to contend with, and in fact many are quite critical of. The establishment of Christian schools in the midst of a society that values educational conformity does require energy, confidence, and resourcefulness. It represents both an act of rebellion against the dominant culture and of commitment to Christian community. Yet fundamentalists have reasserted their presence and influence in the last 3 decades. As they have reasserted their presence in the last 3 decades, they've also become less separatist. While they have established their own separate schools, they've also become engaged in political battles that have drawn them into the secular courts. And I'd like to just highlight here not only some of the ironies and contradictions that arise, but also some of the ways in which they have had an important effect on other arenas of education, both public and private. And I think given the time constraints, I'm just going to do a couple of bullets here. One of the major sort of evangelical fundamentalists celebrate has been the battle to deregulate private schools, that is, to exempt private schools from the accreditation standards required of public schools. And New Right Victory is minimizing the standards for operating a private school, as in the Nebraska case eliminating the requirement for teacher certification by the state, have benefited non-evangelical groups as well. Russell Means, the leader of the American Indian movement, indicated that the successful attempts of removing state certification standards for private schools in South Dakota have made it easier to establish a private school in the Black Hills encampment of the Dakota Sioux. Means can now hire uncertified teachers to instruct children in traditional Sioux ways and values. Deregulation has also benefited the homeschooling movement, numbering somewhere between 248,000 and 354,000 students in the late 1980s, and today between 500,000 and 750,000 students, according to the current figures estimated by the U.S. Department of Education. And I think I'll leave out some more of those data because I think David is going to be talking more about homeschooling. John Holt and Ivan liberal private school movement and homeschooling have found their efforts also have been aided by the fundamentalist victories that revoked certification standards. Experts on homeschooling indicate that religious motivation is a major factor and contend that the large majority of homeschoolers are evangelicals and fundamentalists. Ironically, many school Christian leaders initially opposed homeschooling, fearing that it would draw a lot of the students away from Christian schools. But their position was very difficult to sustain because the primary reason for establishing Christian schools was to honor the belief that parents were primarily responsible for educating their children. So while fighting for parental choice and control in the larger policy arena, we found that resistance to homeschooling on the part of Christian school educators seems to have waned. Another battle site in the war over public schools is out-based education, OBE, a curricular innovation used in several states across the country where students must demonstrate proficiency in certain skills and knowledge before moving on to the next level of instruction. And OBE has been opposed primarily because such programs, critics say, and I quote, intrude upon a parent's rightful role, promote values established by the government rather than the family, and divert scarce resources away from academics. Controversy surrounding the adoption of OBE occurred in Pennsylvania, my home state now, in the early 1990s. While some parents objected to educational reform of any kind, others opposed the experimental nature of OBE. And Christians for Excellence in Education led the fight against the values component in the program. Now, the values component was outcome number 6 of the program, and it established a goal of, and I quote, appreciating and understanding others. And this was the major controversy. To CEE, this meant the promotion of a value system contrary to the student's own, rather than an acceptance of other value systems. To religious conservatives, respect for diversity and a tolerance of differences meant promoting alternative lifestyles, most significantly homosexuality. Rather than teaching students to tolerate diversity, the Christians for Excellence in Education argued that students should be taught a commitment to certain values and perspectives. To aid their campaign, CEE reportedly produced videos, distributed newsletters, and even established a 1-900 number to announce protest dates. Finally, OBE passed in Pennsylvania, but only after outcome 6 was eliminated and the words attitudes and behavior were eliminated from all parts of the program. The objection to programs like OBE lie in the traditionalist Christian belief in the exclusivity of Christianity, which states that only through faith in Jesus Christ's atonement can eternal salvation be attained. If Christianity is the only true religion, fundamentalist Christians believe, then any element of the curriculum that teaches that all religions are equally valid and acceptable threatens the eternal well-being of their children. Similarly, they objected to fostering the abilities to compromise and reach consensus, those are both in quotes, because these practices could lead their children to accept attitudes and practices which they believe Christian scriptures prohibit. Again, homosexuality was a major point of debate here. Objectives that seem to promote relativism as a desired goal are not acceptable to fundamentalists who advocate moral absolutes. Religious conservatives believe that the schools are indoctrinating children with social, political, and economic values. And according to the New Christian Right, environmentalism, globalism, and multiculturalism are all subversive. Nancy Schaefer, president of the Atlanta-based Family Concerns, sees the threat of OBE more starkly, claiming that it's part of a plot construed by the federal government to seize control of public education. And I quote, "We are looking into the eyes of a potential totalitarian state headed for a one-world government." One of the other areas I'm concerned about and have done a lot of research on recently, too, is sexuality education. And the U.S. is the only industrialized country that is not only engaged in a serious debate about whether creationism should still be taught in the Christian schools alongside evolution, but also is the only country that is supplying federal funding for abstinence-only programs. And this has been one of the major victories of conservative Christians and an alliance both between conservative Catholics and Protestants in this area. Initially, pretty much from the 1960s, the New Christian Right was trying to eliminate sex education from the public schools, and in fact it wasn't successful. There was just too much support on the part of the American public for sexuality education. So their more recent tack since the 1980s has been to institute abstinence-only programs, and they've actually been pretty successful here. There have been a lot of programs like Sex Respect that is now being used in at least 5,000 schools throughout the country, and there's a video, No Second Chances, that's shown along with this program that talks about premarital sex being like playing Russian roulette. And as the evangelical educator in front of her classroom of teenagers is talking about Russian roulette, you see this gun, and it's, you can hear the click as it's going around. So the only problem is in Russian roulette, you may only have 1 in 10 chances of dying, whereas with premarital sex, every time you have sex, you have to be prepared to die. And as she gives this delivery, there's a young man in the audience who raises his hand and says, well, what if I do decide to have sex before marriage? She looks at him and says, you'll have to be prepared to die. And all of a sudden on the screen comes this little boy, presumably this little boy, but a picture of a little boy in his cowboy hat on his little pony with his little holster. And you hear this bang, bang, bang. And then you see him flash on now. And then it shifts to a man dying of AIDS in a hospital. It's quite a powerful, fairly sophisticated video documentary, and it's very interesting to be looking at the content of many of these programs. From an evangelical perspective, or from many evangelicals' perspectives, exposure to sex means that it will lead to sex. The political platform of the religious right aims to curtail or severely limit sex education in public schools and contraceptive research and dissemination at large that could make for more responsible decision-making in a pluralistic society. Choice is clearly central to this debate. While rates of pregnancy, AIDS, and other sexually transmitted diseases remain alarmingly high among America's youths, these opponents of sexuality education are trying to censor vital life-saving information from public education that has proven effective in the battle against these problems. Do you want me to end here, or do you want me to do my concluding comments?
How long will they take?
I can take 2 minutes, or I can stop.
Why don't we save them for
Okay. That sounds good.
David Sickink is, as your program tells you, the assistant professor of sociology at Notre Dame and also a fellow in the program in the social organization of schools at the University of Notre Dame. He received his doctorate in sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and they're overlapped with Michael Emerson, who is an associate professor of sociology in my department, our department here at Rice, and happily they are doing some work together on the race and religion and the joint impact that these have on schooling belief, school choices. Dr. Sickink has done some very creative and interesting work on homeschooling, publishing some things that I think some people have found surprising. He's gone at this with great thoroughness and great fairness, and I think you will enjoy hearing David Sickink talk about this burgeoning, very widespread movement of homeschooling. David Sickink.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to follow Susan Roche. She was the author of the first book that I read on homeschooling in graduate school and got me off on the right start. And it's a very honor to follow her, and it's an honor to speak to you tonight. I want to talk about homeschooling, both the social sources of homeschooling and the political implications of the homeschooling movement. And I think that homeschooling raises some central questions about U.S. public life. What does democracy need for our common life together? What common institutions do we need through which we solve social problems? What is the place of expertise in a democracy? What is the relationship between the state, the family, and public goods? And most centrally in my work here, what is the relationship between religion and public life? Can a democracy survive educational diversity, including faith-based education? And does homeschooling contribute to a troubling educational diversity? Now, on the one hand, there's the positive spin. Homeschooling has come of age. It was a renegade just 20 years ago, and it's become an accepted alternative. Witness the positive press in the New York Times, in Time, Atlantic Monthly, Wall Street Journal, etc. The support from President Bush. So it's come of age, it's become normalized in many ways. And I would argue that outside of school desegregation, this is the most significant educational movement in the last 40 years. And that in that group I would include charter schools and school choice. And it's partly so significant because of the growth of the movement. Now the growth depends on how you define homeschooling. I'm using a definition from the National Center of Education Statistics that homeschooling is when parents mostly educate their children at home instead of at school. Now, in reality, what you find is movement hybrids. As the National Household Education Survey has shown, and some data that I'm using, most homeschoolers are involved in some type of organized schooling as well. They have science classes together in the church kitchen. They will sometimes hire a tutor to do higher math classes or language classes. They'll cooperate. Even in some of the courses that they, in some of the subjects that they provide. But homeschooling is such a significant movement mainly, or partly, at least partly, because of the size. In 1999, the U.S. Department of Education estimated that there were 850,000 homeschoolers in the U.S. That was based on a telephone survey done by the U.S. Department of Education. My argument is that that estimate is a little bit low. If you were a homeschooler and you received a call from the U.S. Department of Education wanting to ask you some questions, what do you think you would do? I think there are many homeschoolers that probably hung up, and I would estimate that at least now for sure you're probably looking at 1 million homeschoolers in the United States. In terms of relative size, we're talking about a movement that includes 1.7 to 2% of the approximately 52 million students in the United States. Now that's about twice as many students as there are in the entire Houston School District, and it's well over twice the size of the charter school movement in the United States. So on the positive side, we find for the most part that the kids are doing fine academically in home schools. We don't have really good research on this, and part of the problem is that we don't know how well homeschoolers would do if they were in public schools. But if any one of you would want to volunteer for my experimental research study, in which I'll assign you randomly, you and your children, to homeschooling, then we'll have a better idea of how this works academically. What the study shows so far is that it is very encouraging for homeschooling. Homeschooling children seem to do as well or better than their public school peers, and parent involvement seems to be the key to that success. Homeschoolers, as I'm sure you've heard, are winning spelling bees and other national academic contests. They seem to do better on standardized tests, and they do very, very well on college entrance exams. They've been accepted into some of the premier universities of the country, and starting from the top, including Rice, Harvard, Stanford, Brown, and North Carolina. And we won't even mention Duke, even if they had homeschoolers. And besides academically, we find that the kids seem to be doing fine socially. Socialization, the big question about homeschooling, or as homeschoolers themselves call it, the S word. So what does socialization mean? How are you going to evaluate socialization without defining it? And there are, of course, a number of different definitions that people are assuming when they talk about socialization. Does it mean that that kids should learn how to defend themselves against a school bully? That they should learn to sink or swim in adolescent school culture? Does it mean that they should learn to interact with racial, religious, and economic diversity? Or does it mean that they have to learn some fundamental truths about our history and democracy? How you answer that question will tell you a lot about whether you agree they're being socialized adequately. But the studies seem to show that the homeschooling population is well adjusted, that homeschoolers tend to be less dependent on their peer culture, that they're interacting with younger kids and older adults to a greater extent. They tend to be friendlier, have higher self-esteem, and to be more mature. There is also work that shows that homeschooled kids interact with as many different kids as public school kids do. And in terms of racial interaction with difference, homeschooled moms that I talked to said that they try to set up opportunities in which their kids can interact with racial diversity, and they find that they can do that in positive settings, so that the kids are not learning racism within the schools, as they expect they might in public schools, but they're learning racial interaction in a much more positive way. In addition, homeschoolers are doing a lot of activities with other families and children. Some 80% of homeschoolers are in a homeschooling support group or planning to join one. Many cooperate for special classes and extracurricular activities, higher math, science, language, music, starting soccer and basketball teams, taking field trips to the museums. Homeschooling parents are very active in groups. In addition, there are homeschoolers that are taking part in extracurricular activities at school and in the community. About 10% of homeschoolers take part in extracurricular activities at the local public school, according to U.S. Department of Education data, and that seems to be increasing. There are new forms of cooperation between public schools and homeschoolers, and some of the examples of this are in San Diego, where school districts actually charter schools start charter schools for homeschooling families, and they receive some state funding to do so. Other examples in Washington as well, where homeschoolers are coming in to the public schools for part of their education. So what's the problem? Academically, it seems to work, and for most, the kids seem to be doing well socially. There certainly are some exceptions. And what are the implications, though, for public schools and for educating the disadvantaged in our society? Shouldn't we all agree to use public schools? That we need the energy and skills of the homeschooling parents within the public schools? That America needs a public institution for educating everyone to be democratic citizens? And what about the relationship between the homeschooling movement and the conservative Christian social movements? Doesn't this portend a fragmentation of our society along religious lines, a balkanization of our society? Now, the negative spin I think you can take from Sarah Diamond, who wrote in 1998, Christian homeschooling combines an isolationist mentality with living also in a diverse modern society. The Christian homeschoolers want to nurture their children in an environment protected from government regulation and other worldly cultural influences. But that is not all they want. They also want a say in how and even whether government educates everyone else's children. Their goal is a biblically ordered, hierarchical society in which men and women, parents and children, rich and poor, believers and heathens, all know their place. Now, I don't know about you, but Diamond scares the bejesus out of me. I'm not sure if it's all accurate, but it's very scary. Susan Rose's book titles scare me too, but her books are great, keeping them out of the hands of Satan. I would argue, though, that what you really find amongst the conservative Christian homeschoolers is a great deal of diversity, and that you don't find a disciplined marching Christian crusade, that the movement into homeschooling, even amongst evangelical Protestants, owes as much to changes in American culture, in views of children, and the relationship of public school and community, as it does to religious doctrine. Religious doctrine matters, but not simply as a blanket condemnation of public schools. And I would further argue for the political implications of homeschooling, that homeschooling families are not, for the most part, withdrawing from society, but creating new organizations and networks that increase the overall civic engagement in America. And I would argue this is a public good, and that this argument applies to conservative Christian homeschoolers as well. Now, I did my research, and I brought along a homeschooler with me. My wife, Karen, if you'd stand up. I brought an Indiana homeschooler that I wanted to use as part of the research here. So this is Exhibit A, and you didn't find her scary, I'm sure. She educated our daughter Anna at home for kindergarten. She's a former K-1 school teacher. Notice that she is white, that she is from a two-parent family, that she has a higher than average number of kids, 3 kids in her family, that she has relatively high church attendance, fairly high education, a master's in education. She's not working for pay, though she's working a lot. But that's very common amongst homeschoolers, that the mom does the homeschooling. She's from a family of medium income, but not too high. I can vouch for that. And that she's not from the Northeast. The Northeast tends not to have as many homeschoolers, but she's not from the West, so she's not the best example. You're much more likely to have homeschoolers in the West. Let me show a chart that shows some of the reasons why parents choose to homeschool. As you can see at the bottom, the main reason that parents tend to give is that they can give the child a better education at home. About 38%, however, cite religious reasons for homeschooling. Poor learning environment at school, 26%. The respondents were allowed to give multiple answers here, and many did. So why did we homeschool Anna? Well, first you have to know Anna. It's not Anna's fault, as I'm sure you can tell. And why do we not homeschool Anna anymore? And again, I think you have to know Anna. The bottom line here is that Anna didn't want to go to school, and Anna did want to go to school. Anna gets what Anna wants. Now, when I grew up, my dad would have said, get on the bus and get going. If you have problems at school, that's a character-building opportunity. Hardship at school, it might be good for you. In my family, they trusted the teachers. The teachers were part of the community and local churches. Education in my family was something separate from ordinary life experience, something that others knew well and could teach. Teachers were dispensers of expert knowledge. Children were the containers to be filled up. In my family, the collective identity of the community was meaningful. To leave public school was an affront to neighbors and friends, and it was an affront to relatives who had friends in the public school. To pull your kids out of public school was to risk being accused of not being social, of being too good for the public schools and for our community. And I think those examples, although anecdotal, point to some very important social sources of homeschooling that are due to social change over the last 40 years. But before I go into those, I want to give just a brief history of homeschooling. And a lot of this history is coming from a book by Mitchell Stevens called The Kingdom of Children, excellent book that just came out from the Princeton University Press. The emergence and growth of the homeschooling movement came from two very different educational traditions. On the one hand was the left progressive alternative school movement of the 60s and 70s, and the other was the conservative Protestant Christian day school movement. The progressive school reform of the 60s and 70s were frustrated with achieving social change through the public school system. The left wing argued that we had to free the children by doing your own school. Author activists such as Stephen Ahrens, Jonathan Kozol, and widely read authors such as Ivan Illich and John Holt were instrumental in spreading the gospel of freeing the children. Their aim was to level the authority relations between teachers and students, to give students more say over education. John Holt argued that conventional classrooms are detrimental to kids. Nobody starts out stupid, he writes. You only have to watch babies and infants to see that they show a style of life and a desire and ability to learn that in an older person we might well call genius. But what happens as we get older to this extraordinary capacity for learning and intellectual growth? He argued that the competitive and judgmental environment of school kills the educational instinct. What happens is that this capacity for learning is destroyed, and more than by any other thing, by the process we misname as education. We adults destroy most of the intellectual and creative capacity of children by the things we do to them or make them do. With John Holt's writings, child-centered learning was up and running, and it was wildly popular. Holt's book sold over 1 million copies. And he made an argument for unschooling, and by this he meant that learners should see themselves as agents, not acquire knowledge from teachers, that learning is something that's innate, and that we should trust the ability to acquire knowledge by following the child's interests, and that learning should happen and has to happen outside of school organizations, that hierarchies and bureaucracy crush the innate capacity and creative curiosity of children. So it was very anti-institutional. An early homeschooler who looked back to those days said, "I wasn't saying to my kids, this is what you have to know, and this is when you have to know it. In school, kids are working to achieve someone else's goals. I wanted to see what would happen if you took kids who are intrinsically bright and let their minds be free." Holt's magazine, Growing Without Schooling, was a major part of the beginning of the homeschool movement amongst the progressive left, and he worked hard to build a national network of homeschooling support groups. It's ironic, I think, that in some ways, some of the success of John Holt's ideas in changing public schools would lead to an increase in homeschooling amongst conservative Protestants. The other major source of homeschooling cultural frameworks is Raymond and Dorothy Moore, who were Seventh-day Adventists. And in the 70s, Raymond and Dorothy Moore were arguing that you had to reform public schooling and not push kids into heavy academic work at younger and younger ages. So kids weren't ready for a conventional classroom until they met a certain level of maturity, and each individual reached that at their own time. So conventional classrooms were detrimental when the child is not ready. And they developed this sense, this critique of public schooling into support for what they called home-based education. Unlike Holt, it wasn't that they wanted no educational authority. For the Moores, they replaced the conventional school authorities with parents. Mothers and fathers, they say, can provide deeper security, sheerer closeness, sharper instincts, longer continuity, warmer responses, more logical control, and more natural example than the staff in the best care center or kindergarten. And their argument was based on religious reasons as well. As they said, let us not forget that the God who designed the kids ordained the family to nest them, and let the school follow thereafter. So what Holt elaborated was this generic conflict between individuals and bureaucracies. And in doing so, he built up a rationale for homeschooling that harmonized well with the anti-establishment sensibilities of liberals. The Moores built their rationale in the language of child development, but also in a manner that underscored traditional parental authority in a way that appealed to many conservative Protestants. Now, in the interest of time, I'll skip over some of the organizational growth of the movement in the 80s. One of the key parts of this was James Dobson and his group Focus on the Family and his radio program, which sponsored the Moores and supported their work. The rise of the Homeschooling Legal Defense Association as well, that changed laws in all 50 states now to allow homeschooling. But the two important sources of homeschooling then are the conservative Christians, including Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses as well in that camp here, which probably amount to about 70% of homeschoolers, and then the progressive, secular, countercultural parents, sometimes on the New Age side. Some of these are legacies of the hippies as well, as my advisor called them, the nuts and raisin crowd. So I want to put up another slide to show you how the homeschoolers differ. That's right. To show you the extent to which the homeschooling parents attend church. And you can see 64% of homeschoolers attend church nearly every week. Now that includes traditional Catholics as well as evangelical Protestants, but that's a fairly good way of figuring out which of these homeschoolers are in the conservative Christian camp. You can also see the nuts and raisins crowd, if you want to use that, down there on the never, the 12%. You see a little blip up there as well. So what are the social sources of homeschooling then? And first, I'll put up a slide so I can run through this a little bit more quickly. First, that the organization of social life has disrupted the public school and the community bond. Bedroom communities, long commutes to work, geographic mobility, especially of the family, has freed has freed parents from the social pressure to attend public schools. Note that homeschooling is much higher, or somewhat higher, in areas of greater residential mobility, probably an indication that homeschooling is partly a response to this separation between the public schools and the local community. Professionalization of educators orients teachers and administrators to professional communities outside the local community. To the extent that schools are structured to a greater extent in a bureaucratic form, the tie between the public school and the community weakens. Secondly, I want to argue that the view of children as autonomous individuals, as miniature adults, is part of what fuels the homeschooling movement. That is, that children have an essence that only needs the right environment to shine forth, an inner bud that will emerge if it's not squelched. Many evangelical homeschoolers as well adopt aspects of this modern view of children, allowing children to make choices, listening carefully to children, treating them as little adults. Child-centered parenting is part of the reason for the dramatic growth in homeschooling. The third social change that I think has been a source of the homeschooling movement is the anti-institutionalism of the 60s that set up a conflict between large-scale organizations which were seen as alienating to true human selves, to the individual. And homeschoolers consistently complain of the disjuncture between a school system that treats children in standardized ways and what they believe to be the essential individualism of their own children. And I'll skip over the expansion of the managerial state. We can talk about that later if you want. But I think reducing the trust in public institutions through the Vietnam War, Watergate, and then questioning the inherent value of expertise and experts have also contributed to the rise of the movement. But a couple I want to focus on more is the increasing levels of education among nearly all sectors of society. The parents increasingly have the resources to take up homeschooling successfully. Rising levels of education lead to a reduced sense that school knows best and perhaps greater confidence in one's own ability to carry out the task of educating children. And this is especially true for women, I think, and conservative Protestants. And lastly, I would argue that the conflict between work and home for women today is another source, social source of the homeschool movement. The homeschool movement is primarily a women's movement. Women are the ones who teach the kids, organize the events, write the newsletters, run the home-based businesses. And that even within the evangelical Protestant world, the feminist movement and social norms about what women should do, that women should have careers, has made an impact. Homeschooling empowers women who can stay at home yet be at work. Homeschool moms emphasize that they are not just housewives. At the same time that they disparage mothers who jeopardize their kids by being at work. So homeschooling emerges then as kind of a middle ground between housework and paid work. By homeschooling, women enjoy a measure of the status that attends to teaching and movement building. They are not just moms. Okay, I'm going to have to wrap up, so what I'm going to do real quickly is make an argument about the political implications of the movement. And here, I will focus here on cultural aspects. Let me even skip over that and skip right to this question of whether homeschoolers are isolated and privatized. Should we see homeschooling as an ultimate form of privatization? Now, it didn't seem that way, at least, when you saw the lobbying success on the teacher certification issue in Congress in 1994, where homeschoolers were able to use their networks to flood Congress with phone calls and essentially won the day on whether homeschooling moms had to be certified. My questions here are the implications of homeschooling for civic engagement. Outside of this telephone writing and letter writing campaign, are homeschoolers generally drawn from political life? How does homeschooling affect the types of political activities that parents take up? My argument here, very, very briefly, is that homeschooling has different implications for political participation and civic participation of parents. On the one hand, they're not connected to local public schools. That tends to reduce their opportunities for involvement, since many parents are mobilized into the political process through their local public school. In addition, homeschoolers to some extent are cultural outsiders, at least in terms of their opposition to the dominant norms of schooling and their general countercultural orientation. So these are the two negatives that would reduce their political participation. On the other hand, homeschoolers have built very strong homeschooling organizations and networks of organizations. They've constructed the kind of bonding social capital, these dense network ties that Putnam have argued are very important for generating civic participation. In addition, homeschoolers, just by being homeschoolers, tend to enhance their civic skills, and these may translate into the political sphere. So they teach history and government to their kids, which increases their political knowledge. They try to get their kids involved in real-world experiences for their children, which connects them to the local community. And just in teaching and learning to teach their kids, homeschooling moms evidence higher levels of personal efficacy. So what I find then when I look at National Center for Education statistics is that homeschoolers do come out relatively high on measures of political efficacy and knowledge, especially political knowledge, controlling for all kinds of other differences about homeschoolers. So they're significantly less fatalistic. They have high confidence that they can be involved in government in a meaningful way. On the other hand, most of the homeschooling political participation is oriented towards boycotting and protesting. It's not, they are not distinguishing themselves in terms of voting, not in terms of voting, participating in a political meeting, and some of the more conventional forms of political participation. And my argument is that as homeschoolers, they are somewhat marginal to the majoritarian political system, in that to pursue their interests through the system is not effective. And on the other hand, they are well networked and they have the civic skills to be very active in contacting elected officials. So in that sense, homeschooling does actually lead to greater involvement in civic participation. So I'll close there.
Our last speaker is Dr. Bruce Biddle. He's a professor of psychology as well as sociology at the University of Missouri, and as a veteran student of many aspects of education. He has not only studied education in this country, but has done comparative work with Australia and New Zealand. He has a book coming later in this year dealing with the things that have to do with the effectiveness of school principals. He has written extensively about analyzing what makes for effective teaching, what kinds of methods work better. He is working on a handbook that will spotlight innovative work on teachers and teaching. And as your program notes, he has a landmark book with David Berliner, The Manufactured Crisis, Myths, Frauds, and the Attack on America's Public Schools, which is available at an Amazon.com website near you. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Bruce Biddle to Rice tonight.
I'm going to talk about the separation between two different kinds of conservative thought. It's a fairly simple message, and it's fairly fundamental in terms of the way in which we probably should be thinking about what's going on in terms of the attacks upon public education at the present time. As a general rule, it's convenient to separate out fiscal conservatives from social conservatives in our thinking. And I can see a number of you nodding. You're probably familiar with this distinction, but let me just run through it for a bit, because some of this will be new to some of you, and by rehearsing it, we may be able to sort out a bit of not only the similarities between these two groups, but also the differences between them. Fiscal conservatives in general are people who represent traditional large-scale business interests in American society. These people, in fact, certainly share an ideology. That ideology is promoted by major right-wing think tanks. The Heritage Foundation, the Hudson Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution, the Manhattan Institute, the Madison Center for Educational Affairs, and so forth and so on. In other words, there's a lot of money that's involved in the promotion of an educational ideology among these people. There are also identifiable leaders among these folks. Lou Gerstner, former CEO from IBM, for example, is a leader of them. Harold McGaugh, Norman R. Alexander, the Business Roundtable in general. These people are very active in terms of trying to promote certain kinds of changes in the public education system. And furthermore, they have spokespersons, persons who can be counted upon to repeat their messages. People like Bill Bennett and Chucker Finn and Diane Ravitch and the like. These people will they come and go, but they can be counted upon on regular basis to come forward and make pronouncements that reflect the ideology of these folks. Well, what is that ideology? What do they believe? As a general rule, they're interested in free enterprise and the promotion of free enterprise. They believe that free enterprise will win the day, despite all evidence to the contrary, that it should be applied to all institutions of life. And that means that we should be, with the possible exception of the Army and the police force, everything else should be privatized. This includes education, of course. It's not just that they believe in free enterprise, but they also believe in international competition. They believe in Taylorism. I know that you know what that phrase means. Taylorism refers to the theories of Taylor, who in fact took a look at the Ford assembly line and said that this was the way we should organize all of our corporations, that what we should have is a group of thoughtful planners, and everybody else should be workers, and the workers should do exactly what we tell them to do, and that they should be rewarded for doing exactly what we wanted, and they should be punished if they did not do what we wanted them to do. And these beliefs are backed up with a certain amount of, what shall I say, of belief that the majority of people are not really very useful. The poor and ethnic minorities are in fact deficient. Quite often they are deficient intellectually. But if they're not deficient intellectually, they are deficient in terms of motivation, or perhaps they are deficient because they grew up in a culture of poverty. Regardless, they are in fact deficient, and therefore they cannot be trusted, and we are wasting our time essentially to spend a great deal of money on these people in the public sector. In addition, the public sector, and this includes public education, is corrupt, it's inefficient, and it simply is unable to do the things that we want it to do, and that these beliefs are pretty well ingrained. What should we do in order to correct these evils? Well, obviously, one of the things we should do is to privatize schools, hence what Susan was referring to as Chris Whittle and the Edison Project, which I can't tell from the latest news from Philadelphia whether Chris Whittle is actually going to win and succeed in privatizing the Philadelphia public schools or not. It's a toss-up still. But the idea is that what we should do is, if possible, to destroy the public schools in favor of a private, competitive school system. So if we can, let's privatize everything. If we can't privatize everything, then we have a number of different options that are open to us. The first option, of course, was the one that was pushed very heavily during the Reagan and during the elder Bush years in the White House, and that was vouchers. The idea was that what we would do would be to give money to parents who would thereafter spend that money on sending their children to the schools of their choices. Unfortunately, they were, despite the enthusiasm for the fiscal conservatives, they were never able to talk the Congress into vouchers. So immediately after George Herbert Walker Bush was defeated, the charter school movement erupted. The charter schools being in certain states like this one, and Arizona and Ohio, the charter schools being a synonym, essentially, a less threatening synonym for vouchers, whereas in other states, such as Massachusetts and Minnesota, for example, charter schools were kept within they were just simply a choice movement within the public school system. In addition, a number of other programs for, quote, improving education, unquote, have surfaced recently. One of them, of course, is high-stakes testing, the one that's been pushed very, very strongly, beginning in the Clinton years and with Bill Clinton's connivance, and now by the younger Bush, and the idea being that if we can simply demand that schools produce what we want in terms of outcomes, who cares what those schools do in order to generate those outcomes? And I don't think I need to tell you that there isn't much evidence that high-stakes testing is not going to accomplish this at all. Now, lest I spend too much time on fiscal conservatives, I'll stop right there, and except that I'd like to point out that these folks believe strongly in government. They, in fact, the fiscal conservatives are very much interested in using government, in fact, in strengthening the government role in public education. And in that, they stand quite in opposition to the social conservatives, and particularly the Christian right, the fundamentalist Christian right, which Susan was talking about so effectively earlier on. The Christian right movement, in its interest in education, as Susan pointed out, it's not something new that's on the scene. It has erupted now with much more vigor in the last 20 years, and there are a whole series of people who have been very, very active, major players. People like Francis Schaeffer and Rousas John Rushdoony and David Barton and Russ Walton, Tim and Beverly LaHaye, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, James Dobson, Robert Simons, Gary Bauer, and the like, who in fact have been very active in pushing Christian right messages with regard to public education and also private school alternatives and homeschooling. And the fact is that what these folks are on about, although it sounds quite crazy to those of us who are committed to an ecumenical school system which welcomes diversity, that what these people are on about devolves pretty directly from American Puritan thought. In other words, the kinds of ideas that the Puritans brought to Massachusetts with them can be traced directly to the beliefs which many of these folks still carry around with them today. These thoughts having to do with biblical revelation, the idea that God's word is inviolate, the notion that they form a city on the hill, that they are responsible for bringing the word of God to all persons, all non-believers, whether they are in fact nominal Christians who have not yet been saved, or heathens of one sort or another. And the beliefs which these people share in common with one another about the public schools runs something like the following. I don't know that I have it all here, but the public schools have declined recently, that as a result of federal pressure and governmental pressure, generally speaking, they have begun to expurgate religious materials from their shelves and from their curricula. They have that roles played by parents in public schools have been squelched. There's been intrusion by the government into the governance of public education. Increasing professionalism among educators, that educators, as they have had more and more training, more and more certification in public education institutions, they've become less and less valuable as guides for training people in the Word of God. The increased reliance on technical ideas and equipment, and increasing emphasis on science and on evidence, particularly evidence which favors such things as evolutionary theory, impulse expression, psychology in general, sociology, and other forms of the social and behavioral sciences, tolerance for homosexuals and the like, that as a result of which the schools have become something quite different from what these folks thought the schools were, and perhaps they were to some extent a generation or two ago, and that the public schools are now becoming places where gasp secular humanism is practiced. And that's the catch-all phrase that, in fact, describes everything that is wrong with public schools, secular humanism. Now, as both Susan and David pointed out, one alternative for these people is obviously to withdraw from public education, that is to form private schools or to engage in homeschooling, and so therefore to solve the problem outside of the public sector. Well, this doesn't work very well for a number of people, so consequently the people in the religious right are in fact also motivated to try to reform the public schools and to try to take a number of actions to control the public schools. And how do they do this? Well, one of the things that they do is to try to gain control over the school boards. That is, that they run for school boards, and if they if they succeed in getting themselves elected to school boards, either at the local level or in some cases, as in recently in Kansas, for example, they were able to gain majority control over the state accreditation agency in education in the state of Kansas. What they do is essentially to enforce their own beliefs about what schools should do. That is, they take control of the curricula if they can, and if they can't, then they try to close down the schools. They lobby for, they argue against any kind of bonds for the schools. In other words, they try to weaken the schools, public schools, to the extent they can. In so doing, by the way, they apparently are perfectly willing to lie, cheat, and steal. In other words, they are perfectly willing to run for these various these various control agencies under false colors. They are violently in favor of reducing the role of government, and so consequently they can be counted upon to stand up and try to do everything they can to reduce the role of not only the federal the education budget. They'd like to see the Department of Education abolished at the federal level, but they would also they're also interested in restricting the role of the courts with regard to education and so forth. But with one exception, of course, and that is that they would like to see federal funds diverted to the support of private schools, particularly religious schools. In the process of doing this, I've stressed a little bit about the fact that the religious right and the social conservatives more generally have a somewhat different agenda than the fiscal conservatives with regard to public education. And they brawl with each other to some extent concerning this, and you can see some of this played out when they are really very angry. It turns out, of course, that the fiscal conservatives are much more powerful. They've got a lot more dough. They are, in general, they control the Republican Party. The religious right does not. They're more of a fringe group as far as the Republican Party is concerned, except when it comes to election time. And when it comes to election time, of course, then you will see Republican national candidates showing up at some of the most conservative religious institutions and making speeches in order to persuade the religious right that they are actually going to represent them. However, it turns out that both groups of conservatives, like conservative movements in all societies, not just the United States, but they're very much against science in general. They're against evidence, and they're perfectly willing to lie. And the lies are absolutely fascinating because, in general, conservative figures, when they don't have the evidence, they just make it up. And a very good example of this is Bill Bennett. Bill Bennett, former Secretary of Education, who in fact postures himself as a major proponent of moral rectitude, is an inveterate liar when it comes to education. He can't open his mouth without making things up. I'm quite serious about this. Take any speech he makes in which he touches on education, and he lies. He makes up evidence that just doesn't exist, and it's a fascinating sort of thing. He's an outstanding example of this sort of thing, but almost everybody does, who's other people like Chuck Finn, Diane Ravitch, and so forth and so on. They lie all the time, and it's fascinating. Occasionally I appear on platforms with these people, and it's a lot of fun. And because they have no respect for evidence whatsoever, and all they have to do is flash the evidence. And it turns out that they not only make claims about the efficacy of education, which have no basis in validity basis in evidence whatsoever, but also, of course, what they are trying to do all the time is to divert attention away from the real problems of American public education. I don't want to give you the notion that American public education is without problems. In fact, American public education suffers from some of the most severe problems of education in any industrial nation. Let me just give you two of them so that you can later on, if anybody wants. I don't want to take any more time than the next 3 minutes, so I won't show you slides, but I have them with me. One of the problems that the United States public school system suffers from is an enormous level of poverty among the children of the nation. I don't know that you know this, but the poverty rate in the United States among school-aged children is 3 to 5 times greater than that of any other industrialized nation. The poverty rate of school-aged children in places like Germany or Norway or France or Spain, or for that matter Japan, the poverty rates among children run between 5 and 10%. The poverty rates for children in the United States are more than twice that number. They run around 22, 23, 24%. Now, I'm not making this up. These statistics are easy to come by. And it turns out, therefore, that the kids who come through the doors of the public schools of our country, in fact, are posing an enormous burden, an enormous problem for the teachers and administrators who run our public schools, because they are trying desperately, somehow or other, to rescue these kids, to rescue from the poverty in which they live. And the unfortunate fact that many of them do not have medical care, many of them do not have adequate nutrition, many of them do not, in fact, have any books in the home, let alone computers or any other aids for education. And the fact that our schools do as well as they do, our public schools, given this problem, is an amazing grace. We are blessed with some of the most effective education teachers, most effective public education personnel in the entire world. The second problem, which American public education labors under, is unequal funding. The United States is absolutely unique among all Western nations in that we, in fact, provide very poor funding for our poorest communities, and we provide very high levels of funding for our rich suburban communities. The reason why we do this, of course, is because we tax ourselves at the local levels, local school board taxes, which still pay a little over 50% of the total cost of education is paid for at the local level in the United States. We're the only nation in the world that does this. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So what happens is that we take the poorest kids in the nation and we give them the poorest schools. How big are these differences? The schools in the poorest school districts in America around are providing education at the rate of about $3,000 to $4,000 per student per year. The schools in our rich suburbs that ring our major cities are providing education at the tune of $15,000 per student per year. Now that's an enormous difference. What does that buy? It buys these beautiful campuses. It buys schools with every possible advantage in the suburbs. And it buys unbelievable educational hovels in our city centers, and we call them all public schools. I'm serious about this. So our public education system is laboring under two enormous burdens: the poverty of the kids who come through the door and unequal school funding. And these problems just are not discussed, and they will not be discussed by either of these right-wing groups.
We have some time for discussion and questions. First of all, do you all have questions that you would like to ask each other? Well, go go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in the audience, but in the conclusions, too, I came back to some of the issues of equity, the conclusions that I didn't share with you. But I think, again, given the two major problems that you just talked about, one of the concerns in terms of people separating, whether it's in the context of homeschooling or in terms of Christian schooling, is often this microcosm where there may be greater consistency and more of a community built in for their own children, but it appears to me even less concern about all of the children of the nation. And this is where I see actually some of the fiscal conservatives and social conservatives coming together with many of the people whom I've interviewed in these schools of being very involved in Christian education. Many of them who have their children in Christian schools actually get elected to the public school boards and would be very active in lobbying very actively against any tax increases to support public education. So I see this is very much tied together as well, that it's sort of interesting on the one hand having an aversion to social Darwinism and survival of the fittest on the one hand, and yet supported free enterprise on the other, and in fact leaving public education in many ways to the survival of those who may make it, and not worrying so much about 25% of America's children who aren't being properly provided for, either within the context of incomes in the home or within the context of public education. So that's, I guess, less a question, but a comment in terms of, I think, a lot of common ground there.
Bruce, in case there's anyone here who questions your statements about Bill Bennett and Diane Ravitch being inveterate liars, would you care to give any examples or elaborate on that? Or
Oh, sure. I'm perfectly. I don't know that you can recall what Bill Bennett was doing when he had the national platform, and when he was in fact regularly. I think about once a month he was on with his graphs and charts and so forth and so on. He just made up all of the data that he was talking about. The fact was that almost all of the stuff that he showed on those programs was made up. It's a very odd sort of thing, and because he had the bully platform, since he was a member of the administration, nobody was really willing to jump him on it. Here's another one for you. It turns out, for example, are you familiar with the name Eric Hanashek? He's an economist who has done quite a bit of work as attempting to review research, which he says is related to, among other things, class size. Well, the studies that he reviews aren't related to class size at all. They are related to teacher-pupil ratio. Teacher-pupil ratio is not class size. It has to do with the number of professionals in a school or a school district. And Eric Hanashek knows the difference. In fact, he has written about the difference, and yet he, in fact, continues to lie about the applicability of whatever it is that he has concluded from research on teacher-pupil ratio, and he claims that it applies to class size. In the process, ignoring completely extensive research that has shown that if you, in fact, decrease class size, particularly for kids in the lower grades, particularly for kids who are, believe it or not, poor and who come from ethnic minorities, that they will do much better in public education than if you don't do so. Now, in the process of perpetuating these lies, Dr. Hanashek, in fact, has endeared himself to fiscal conservatives. Indeed, he has just been appointed to the Hoover Institution because he's such an effective liar. And I'm not making this up. I'm sorry.
That's all.
Does that help, Bill?
Well, it adds to the conversation. Let us see what questions we might have from our members of our audience. We have a microphone back here. It'll be better if you can just hold on for that, and then everyone will be able to hear.
Since Bill Bennett is not here to defend himself, I think your comments your criticisms, your labeling of these prominent people as liars is very unprofessional, borders on being unethical, and almost cowardly, since they are not here to defend themselves. You can attack ideas, but to attack people individually is inappropriate in this forum. And you speak as if you're an authority on the conservative movement, and obviously you're not one. So I don't think you're qualified to fully describe the ideology of the social conservatives and the fiscal conservatives, because you're obviously not in that camp.
Well, that's fair enough. I wish that one of these people were here, because I would be delighted to fulfill your challenge, which is a good challenge. What happens under normal circumstances is that people who are interested in weakening the public schools make claims about what the public schools are capable of doing and are not capable of doing. They're usually making, claims about the outcomes of various kinds of educational policies. Now, recently, because of interest in high-stakes testing, for example, a lot of claims have been made about the fact that high-stakes testing, in fact, improves the outcomes of education. That if we have high-stakes testing, that this, in and of itself, will, in fact, improve the achievements of kids in schools. That's the major argument that's made about high-stakes testing. Now, there isn't any evidence whatsoever to back up these claims. None. And whenever you hear anybody asserting that if we put high-stakes testing in place, that there will be an increase in the level of achievement of kids. Now, I don't know how many people that I can cite as individuals who have made this claim. I could cite 15 people who have made it. But they're all talking through their hats. There is no evidence whatsoever to back this up. The evidence that is available suggests that when high-stakes testing programs have been put in place in various states, that nothing has happened, that it has not affected the average achievement level of students at all. In other words, it's simply a waste of money. Now, I don't know how many of these kinds of things that you need for me to provide examples for. The fact is that when you get a group of people who know the answers, who are ideologically committed to a particular position, they are tempted to make claims about the usefulness of that particular position in the absence of evidence. When you review the evidence, turns out sometimes those claims aren't true. Sometimes they are, by the way. It's in some cases that people, there are certain claims that people make which can be backed up by evidence. But as a general rule, when you have a claim that's driven by ideology rather than by any respect for evidence, people are tempted to make claims that cannot be backed up.
Well, I would like to know if any of the three speakers have recommendations to improve student achievement at all levels in K through 12 that do have some evidence to show that they work. I mean, I'm concerned about, as a parent, I wanted to have some record that my children are actually learning. So I have thought that some level of testing is a good idea for me as a parent, to know what's happening to my child in a system that I don't have daily access to what's happening. But at the same time, I want to see improved achievement at all levels for all children. What might work, and what could we do to decrease the deplorable dropout rate that we have in Houston?
Go ahead. I have a really quick comment, so I'll go first and try and tie it into our theme of conservative religion. I think one of the things that can be done is to try and use religion as a tie between lower SES parents and the school, and to use religion to bridge the gap between very professional teachers, a very bureaucratic school system, and parents. And so I think that that might be one way to overcome the gap that I think is growing between the school and the community, and provide a way in which lower SES parents might be more active in the school and more active in their child's education. And I think that could be positive for outcomes. So,
What would that look like?
well, I think
When you're to the lower socioeconomic status?
right.
Okay.
Right. I think some of the experiments that are going on in trying to meld homeschooling populations into the public school, where teachers are being active in trying to involve homeschoolers to the extent homeschoolers are interested in being involved in the public school and public education. There's some places in which I think schools can become a much more diverse place in which not just professional, well-educated parents feel comfortable, but also lower SES parents and parents that are very religious. I'm not saying this is curing everything, I'm just offering it as one.
No, David's onto something. There are some very good experimental studies now underway in which particularly for schools that serve ethnic communities, where the parents are deliberately involved within the school, and where programs to reach out and bring those parents into the school, involve those parents in the education of their children, plan the curriculum around the needs expressed by the parents and the like. And the preliminary, these are experimental studies, and the preliminary evidence from those studies suggests that they're having marvelous effects. It's just exactly what David is talking about. And this is the kind of thing that can be done if you really want to start reaching out and making a community education program rather than something which isolates children from their homes.
Did you have the question, I think, still has probably not quite been addressed as to how would you know that progress has been made. Is that?
Right, and if testing is not...
If testing isn't the answer,
what can the public do to improve achievement in public schools?
Well, you're asking two questions. One, how would we know if we've got a better product coming out the door? And the answer, of course, is that there are new innovations in testing procedures which depend more upon consultation with parents in terms of the values which parents are after, and we don't have a standardized math test that or English language test that's used, but rather we actually consult people in the community with regard to the values which they subscribe to and the goals which they are interested in, and we build a testing program at the local level which will in fact test those things which parents within the community and others in the community want to see promoted for their children. That's part of the answer to your question. But the other half of your question is, what can we do to actually improve the schools? There are lots of very useful things. Cutting class size on the early grades would be one. More parental involvement is another. Cutting the size of our largest schools, making particularly our high schools places where individual students are known as individuals rather than simply numbers or ciphers, and where they are alienated. That's another one. There are a number of different useful things which we can do and which we can encourage, which will improve public education.
okay, Charlotte Kofeld here. Here's your microphone coming.
I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name, Dr.
Sicking.
But I would like to ask you about the question of homeschooling. You've made some very positive remarks about it this evening, and I'm sure it does have many positive aspects. But, you know, back in the days, when you had children from families on the margins of society that were rounded up and brought into school, sometimes these children would attend 2 schools, 3 schools a year. And I guess my question has to do is, how do you know that there is not this vast underground movement of unschooled children in America right now?
Yeah, in some states that would be very difficult because they keep records on what children are there, and if they're not in school, of course, questions would be asked. That's possible. Those are the parents that are going to hang up on the U.S. Department of Education when they call. I think it's fairly unlikely, partly because homeschooling is now has a whole array of organizations and is institutionalized in a way that I think connects most homeschoolers, and there's a few exceptions I think out there, but I think very few. It connects other homeschoolers into a socialization process. So even within homeschooling, it's not so much that individual families are making it up on their own. Almost always, I would argue, they are taking up homeschooling because they have a friend who's a homeschooler. They're getting ideas from their friends about how to homeschool. They're getting involved in homeschooling organizations because they're beneficial to being a homeschooler. So I think for the most part,
there are children who are not being exposed to any formal education, whether it's in the family or in the public schools. How are we going to find these children now that we have no official truant officer, state oversight, local oversight? Everybody has stepped away in the state of Texas and said, it's not my problem.
yeah, I'm not an expert on that, and I imagine in Texas you face certain problems that I'm not as aware of. So I think, I just wouldn't, maybe someone else would have a comment.
One of the problems, too, is that there's variations by state, so that in Pennsylvania, you will know whether children are actually in school or homeschooled. I mean, there is the kind of oversight that there isn't in Texas. So I think that's a concern, and some others may want to comment on that. But sort of following up on your question, I also have a concern about some families in which there may be the degree of control, and I'm thinking about some of the positive correlations between domestic violence and families that adhere to very traditional gender role norms. I mean, traditional patriarchal families where you find greater frequency of domestic violence. So a question, too, in the case where there may be abuse within the family or where the child may be more isolated, since it's up to the homeschooling family whether or not they'd be interacting with others, of whether there's a sense of some problems there, and they're clearly also not necessarily going to be the ones answering the questions that they could pedagogically. But what if a child is then isolated within the home and has no other contact really with other adults, and that may be for some period of time? What happens then if they may be in an abusive situation or an overly controlling, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse? That's always been one of my concerns with increase in homeschooling.
Such things may well happen, but I think David's point about the networking isn't one to be taken seriously. I attended a couple of years ago a major homeschooling conference here in Houston, which was just for this area, and there were many hundreds of people there, dozens and dozens of exhibits well worked out of curriculum, of choice of curricular materials available, and at many sessions, whatever one thinks of what was being taught there were certainly lots of people involved together. So it was not certainly these were not people who were simply isolates who happened to wander in to this organization. That one had a real sense of a network and a deep concern for the education of their children. Again, however effective one may think that turns out to be. Let's take one more question here. We don't want to hold you too late here. We try to keep these to a 2-hour session.
I know people on the left and on the right who homeschool. And the the common, and they homeschool and network together, which is surprising to me too.
The people on the right and the left are networking with each other?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, because they have a common goal, and that's homeschooling. And I think that's just fine, personally. The one thing that I hear the most from the far right that is homeschooling is we want to keep our kids from hearing the four-letter word SEX. Yeah, I can count, but as Ms. Rose mentioned, in Texas, you don't hear that word in public schools. They've been very successful in getting any real knowledge on that topic, even in the high schools, out of the way. It just doesn't happen. But that information is not seems to be understood among the homeschoolers. They come in and talk at where I hear them discussing about how they are protecting their children from learning about sex and that's their number one sin that they're protecting them from. But the public schools don't teach it, but they are told that the public schools teach it. And there are an awful lot of other old wives' tales that they know to be true because they tell one another. That concerns me about what kind of citizens they're building in their homes. Comment?
I don't find that to be one of the major reasons why homeschoolers are outside of the public schools. I think, that may be contributing to some homeschoolers' concerns about public schools. I think in the area of sex education, it raises very difficult questions about how we can have common institutions in which we live with our deepest differences. And I think for homeschoolers to make a decision that they know best about sex education is probably, in our very culturally pluralistic society, a decision that we're going to have to let them make. I think that even if public schools can survive as we think of public schools as representing a certain geographic, to have to decide to make some compromises on very volatile issues like sex education, in which there's almost no way to adjudicate between different views of what kids should know, how they should learn it, and I think we're going to have to leave those behind. The other thing I would say is that I think there's fairly broad support for sex education in schools, and I think for the most part, a lot of conservative Protestants agree with that. Now there are some fundamentalists, of course, that oppose it, but the support for sex education extends within the conservative Protestant world as well, I would say. Now, I can't answer your question very well, but I'll just offer those thoughts.
Well, in response to your question, and as a way of wrapping up here, I think that you are correct in saying that, if I may extrapolate a little bit, that people at both ends of the spectrum and a lot of places along the way know things to be true about other people for which there's actually very little evidence. And that is actually one of the sort of the founding principles, or a great impetus for this series of conversations that we've had here over the past year. Is if you have been attending these, you know that we did not have unanimity on all our panels. That we have had people from a wide range of views, and that often some of those who say things that perhaps you had not been expecting them to say, or you'd been thinking they were a different kind of person than they were. When you hear them, you say, well, I must listen to that. I must give attention to that. And it's not always the case that if we have more communication, what we need is more communication. Sometimes we have more communication, people say, whoo, they're worse than I thought they were. But at least we have an opportunity. We have very little opportunity to settle differences if we really don't know what those differences are. If we don't have an accurate picture of where where people stand and the principles they stand for, and to have at least a healthy respect for listening to them and trying to respond to them as carefully and thoughtfully as we can. And that has been one of the purposes of this series of lectures. I'm sorry he's not here tonight. Mr. Harry Siobhan, whose generosity made this series possible, wasn't able to be with us this evening. But I know he has had a great commitment to this kind of thoughtful exchange between experts at various parts of the spectrum. It's something that I have continued to enjoy, and I hope, and we thank you very much for coming. We thank our participants tonight, and hope that you will keep your eye open for further sessions in these series. Thank you and good night. Thank you.